Well, you actually came back. I hope you rested well. I would have, but I spent the night trying to think of a way to respond to Glenn Pemberton. And I could not think of any lament jokes. So I'm clueless as to how to respond, and he gets to come after me. I just take offense at his making fun of my Texas dialect with the y'all, and I'll see. Today we talk about pronouns, so we go from prepositions to pronouns. Well, one of the topics, very popular topics today, is spiritual formation. Walk into the bookstore and see how many books there are on spiritual formation. Very popular. Actually, the terminology of spiritual formation is centuries old, but it was sort of adopted by Protestants after Roman Catholics had an extensive literature on spiritual formation for those who are church leaders. But spiritual formation had become important for us. I want to talk about spiritual formation, and the title of my presentation is Spiritual Formation is actually Corporate Formation. And I want to talk about the church as the people being formed, not just individuals being formed, but the church as the people being formed. I'll begin my comments with just going through what I discover with the concordance with the word formation. How important it is for Paul, and I honestly think in the old Protestant tradition, the center of Paul's theology was justification by faith, and I would argue that the center of Paul's theology is the formation of the community. That is a very central thing, and with the concordance you can go through and look up the root word morph, which has many variations off of it. But you understand as you go through there, of course, that Jesus took the form of humankind, Philippians chapter 2. But Paul talks about being conformed to his death in Philippians 3. And then Philippians 3:21, he talks about our ultimate destiny is to be conformed to the image of his Son. So it's not just about getting people in, as Keith Stangland's presentation was talking about our understanding of Acts. For Paul, it's not a matter of just getting people in. It is a matter of the formation of the community. And of course today I will talk about 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We are being transformed into his image. And with that, Romans chapter 12, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's very central. But it's not only that word that plays a huge role in Paul. The concept is bigger than the word, and you can also do your concordance search for the word sanctification. May God sanctify you wholly at the day when the Lord returns. Sanctification is something that's not just an event, it is an event, but it is also what God is doing with us. Many years ago, I was working through Paul, and a point that became extremely important to me, I first noticed in 2 Corinthians 1:14 that Paul says, I want to be your boast, and I want you to be mine at the day of Christ. I want the church to be my boast, what I am proud of at the day of Christ. And then I started looking at similar verses throughout the Pauline correspondence. And it was almost like a little thread that runs through all of the Pauline correspondence. The day of Christ, and what is the community going to be? And what I want to emphasize this morning is it's not only that human beings have a narrative, but as I read Paul's letters, the church, the community, has its own narrative. It is telling a story. And I think that's hard to envision in a very mobile society like ours, when we move from place to place, and in a consumer climate, we change churches to fit what's right for us. But what I see and what I think is a missing dimension is that idea of formation. The church has a story to tell. The church is living out a story. And as I see in all of the correspondence, the church, as Paul writes, is in the middle of a story. And that's exactly where you are. You and your congregation at any given time are in the middle of a story. You have a past and you have a future. And that is the question that you have to deal with. Where have we been and where are we going? One of my favorite passages, and it does not have the word formation, but I want to turn your attention to Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. This is one of the great passages that talk about the church having its own story. Paul writes to the Philippians, and as he does in all of his letters, with minor exceptions, he offers thanks for the church. And as you notice in Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 11, here is a church with a past, a present, and the future. As he writes to them, chapter 1, verse 3, I give thanks to my God in all my memories, always, in every petition on your behalf, with joy, making mention at the fellowship, your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. Being persuaded of this, that the one who began in you and y'all a good work will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. There is an image of the church. The church was, once upon a time, it was planted, and the church has a past. There was a moment when God began a good work. We might call that the church planting. I think it's striking in all of Paul's letters, there's a way that he has of going back to the beginning. It's not just individuals who got converted. He doesn't talk that way. He talks about churches being shaped and formed. God began a good work among you. This is God's work, and there are echoes of creation story here, that the creation began when this group of strangers came together and God began a good work. The church has a beginning. Sometimes he says, I planted. And in other places he says, I fathered this community. But it's always the community that had a beginning, and it has a past. Well, churches have memories. And one of our memories is the time in which there was the initial work of shaping and forming the church. But the church also has a present, because he says from the first day until now. There is a past history from the first day until now, as he looks to the Philippians and says, we share a common story. Oh, you sent money to me. Remember that? Remember what is happening from that time a few years ago until now? The church has a memory. And I think there's a place in our preaching for that kind of collective identity that you want to shape in your churches. Not just individuals coming to hear what is there speaking to them, but what is speaking to us as a group. There was a time when God began a good work. And to look back at your congregation, and maybe you were not a part of that, but there was a time when God began a good work at a place. As I began to deal with these passages, I'm always in dialogue with students and ministers and so forth. And it occurred to me how many students that I've known through the past years have the ambition of planting a church, which is a very noble ambition. But it's like a person, sometimes it's almost like the person who spends all the energy planning a wedding without thinking what comes next. And I can tell you, I've traveled enough places to see these churches that were planted with all the air of excitement. But once the excitement was over, there was a little languishing. And I certainly have seen that overseas, where someone was so excited to start something, and then I was there 5 years later and it languished because there was not an idea of getting past the moment of birth. Paul writes to the Philippians, and we can see this church living between the past. What a nice past it had. A great beginning. God began a good work. And there, from the first day until now, those are good times. We have a memory. We have a history. But then, that's not all. The church lives in anticipation of the future. The God who began a good work is also the God who will bring it to a conclusion. And we are in the middle of the story, waiting for God to bring it to conclusion. A work in which the whole community will be a completed work. God will bring it to conclusion. Now that's to me, that was a kind of an eye-opener understanding of church. So cohesive that it has a memory, a collective memory, and also a church that says, where are we going? God is going to bring it to completion, and He sees the church that began as a church with a future that extends until the end. Interesting image of church. And that's why he prays. Where are we going? That's the prayer that Paul offers. What does formation look like? Corporate formation. Well, it so happens that Paul offers thanks for what God has done, but offers petition for what God will do. Chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, this I pray, that your love may abound more and more in all discernment. Love is something that is not acquired at once. And I've always been struck by this passage in that Paul has no direct object here. Often he says that you love one another. That's where we're going, that you love one another. But here, it's a little bit different from his other passages, that you learn to love, period. With sensitivity. That's one way of translating it. Greek word is aesthesis. Our word aesthetics comes from that. With a sense of touch and a sense of nuance. That you learn to love with discernment, with a sense of touch. And secondly, that you learn not only to love, but that you approve the better things. That's interesting that that's actually a very common Stoic phrase for moral behavior, to approve the better things, to have a sense of priorities. This is what I pray, that you love, that you establish a sense of priorities, and that you will be filled with the fruit of righteousness. Here is a church with a past, a present, and a future. And I think that is what we need particularly to enunciate with our churches, where, again, as I mentioned last night, churches in our whole culture, we think of a church as something to serve us and something in which you can obviously always be in transition and change. A collective consciousness, this church is going somewhere. Where is it going? You read the rest of Philippians, and you get a better sense of where the church he anticipates is going. Because he tells the story of the one who emptied himself, didn't look out for his own interests, but looked to the interest of humankind. And he tells his own story as one who has been conformed to the image of Christ when he had all those privileges. Formation. It's not just about planting. It's about formation. Well, as I mentioned on the handout, I first preached on this passage just months before the centennial at University Church. Eddie Sharp let me preach one time. And just before the centennial. And I started wrestling with this passage, and I thought, 100 years behind us. But the real question is, where are we going to be? What's going to happen? And of course, the managerial side of me wants to say, what are the numbers going to be? What's the bottom line going to be? And then I come back to Philippians. Where are we going to be as a community? Are we making any progress in learning to live the story of the cross? Where is the church going? So, just a little homiletical observation. I would introduce this by saying, with our changing times, it is appropriate that we ask where the church is going. We face cultural shifts, demographic shifts, etc. Where do we want to be in a decade, 2 decades, a generation from now? 5 and 10-year plans are common at the workplace. What about the church? Well, the church has a story, as I've mentioned, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we are in the middle. This is a corporate story, and so there is the story of the Philippian church and ours, which had a beginning, a history, up until that moment. God has been at work in the church, but God isn't finished. The church stands in the middle of the story, and as I ask the question, where are we going to be? Are we going to be shaped into the image of Christ? Now that passage does not mention church, but that passage does mention the pronouns, the plural pronoun, it is us. We as a people have a past and we have a future. Now I take you to the second passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. I have a habit, I love 2 Corinthians, spent a lot of time with it, and I have ruined so many people's sermons talking about 2 Corinthians because what we don't want to know is that Paul's we really means I. Paul can be very slippery, moving from I to we, and I don't know how I would grade that on an exam if a person, or an essay, if a person kept moving back and forth between I and we. But the background of 2 Corinthians, of course, is Paul is on the defensive. He's not a very good minister, and he is ineffective. That's what's behind everything that he says. And so in 2 Corinthians 2, chapter 2, verse 14 to 7:4, all of that, with very minor exceptions, everything is we. Present tense, we. Here's what our ministry is all about. Now, when I say it means I, it could mean I and a companion, Paul and Silas or something like that. But it's really Paul who's on the defensive. Very ineffective, and even his own church is questioning his credibility. Now, there's this wonderful passage in 2 Corinthians 3:18. We all with unveiled face, beholding the mirror, as in a mirror, the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. Wonderful passage. You have to look at it in context. This is a very complicated chapter, but the chapter is sort of a unit. And you have to make choices when you preach from a longer text like this, because I think you'd lose your audience pretty fast to work through the rabbinic argument that Paul makes. But in a nutshell, what Paul is doing is to lay out his credentials as a minister. And he compares himself with Moses all through chapter 3. Moses put a veil so people didn't see. And Paul makes a transition. This may have been a defense of his ministry, but it's also an ecclesiological statement about the nature of the church. Because his credentials have to do with what he leaves behind. What kind of community is he leaving behind? I suggest as a sermon that you look at the beginning and the end of chapter 3. Because there is where he is contrasting Israel to the church. And this is no polemical passage about the Old Testament or Israel. This is the defense of his ministry. There's a kind of parallel between 3:2 and 3:18. Because they're about the church. The credentials for Paul's ministry. His letter of recommendation, when they are wanting a letter of recommendation, he says, my letter of recommendation is the church. You plural, are my letter of recommendation. The community, shaped and formed, as troubled as it may be, you are my letter of recommendation, written not on stone, not with ink, but written with the Spirit of a living God. And they are just filled with echoes of Jeremiah and Ezekiel that say when this new age comes, this reconstitution of the people of God, there will be an empowered, Spirit-empowered community. And his credentials are this community's very existence, not like others, but the empowered community that lives out what Jeremiah was talking about. Okay, when you get to chapter 3, verse 18. In this particular chapter, this particular verse, notice that he moves from we to we all. He does that several times in 2 Corinthians. When is he talking about the church? Well, several times he moves from we to we all. Well, there were those people who had the veil who couldn't really see it. But we all, we don't have the veil. We with unveiled face, as we behold, as in a mirror, gaze at the glory of the Lord, are being changed. Passive voice. That's important. Someone is changing us. There is this power at work, and we are being changed into the same image. It might have started as a defense of Paul's work, but it ends with, here is the nature of the church. The church is the community being shaped and formed. If you read 2 Corinthians, you'll find out what shaped and formed means. Because what we learn in 2 Corinthians is that the Christ into whose image we are being shaped is the Christ, the crucified Christ. Paul himself carries around the dying of Jesus. And so he has been shaped himself by the story of the cross. The church is the community that has seen the glory, what others have not seen. And in seeing the glory has been changed. So the story, the church is the community that is being changed. And in 2 Corinthians, we get a real sense of that as the church the transformed church. I have one other passage. Galatians 4:19. My little children, with whom I am in the pangs of childbirth, until Christ be formed in, can you fill out, give me this, until Christ is formed in y'all. Here are several little house churches, the Galatians. And this is sort of the opposite of the Philippians passage, because Paul is in anguish. There's no confidence expressed here. Chapter 4, verse 11, I fear I've worked in vain. Oh, they had a beginning. And if you read the passage, Galatians 4:19 in context, read that paragraph. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning was great. Oh, you took me in, you would have plucked out your eyes for me. What a great beginning for the church. But right now it's not very good. There are people flirting with you, kind of sexual overtones in what he is saying. People making much of you. You're being seduced. And then, I am in the pangs of childbirth. Paul, most of the time he's a father. This time he's a mother. Pregnant. Until Christ be formed. Take shape. In you. Lewis Martin in his Galatians commentary says it should be translated in your congregations, because the Galatians are not just one little community. Until Christ be formed among you, in your congregations. The church is in the middle of the story, and its outcome is uncertain. Quite different from the Philippians passage. Oh, I'm confident in Philippians. God's going to finish the task. But I think there's something to say for where we are in the middle of the story now. Where is it going to turn out? Are we filled with seductions everywhere from the gospel? Things that just take away our time, energy, priorities. All kinds of seductions that we face. How's the story going to turn out? We began so well until it just hasn't happened yet. That fetus has not been formed yet. Until Christ be formed among you. Read the rest of Galatians and you'll see what formation means. Works of the flesh, fruit of the Spirit. What does formation mean? Formation here is the absence of self-serving behavior. The works of the flesh are these. And so we have the absence of self-serving behavior that he has in Galatians 5:19 and following. Then you have the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. The absence of self-serving behavior. The church is being formed. Well, as I was thinking about how to approach this passage, I think could go along very well with the Philippians passage if you were to do this in a series. Because both are doing basically the same thing with a different outcome facing the community. And I think there's a place for us to preach the Philippians passage, where are we going? And say it with confidence that God is going to bring our story to an end. Let me go back to the Galatians passage. Where do we stand right now? There are threatening forces out there, cultural shifts, that are very seductive. But here we are with Christ being shaped among us so that we become what He wants us to be. Let me mention the last part of my presentation. I'm struck as I read all of Paul's letters, this kind of theme. The outcome, we have a present tense in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. We are being transformed. You have the same present tense, passive voice, in Romans 12:2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And if you look at if you look at Romans as a whole, sometimes people don't know where to stop reading Romans, and there's a tradition of stopping Romans about Romans 4. Long tradition in Protestantism of stopping Romans about Romans 4. But the rest of Romans is about transformation. And in that transformation, Paul says the ultimate destiny that we have, having been baptized, coming up, living this new existence, the ultimate destiny, Romans 8:29, is to be conformed to the image of the Son. That's exactly what he says in Philippians 3:21. To be conformed to the image of the Son. And so he describes how we begin at baptism. Something totally new. It's like the planting. Something totally new at baptism. But a new existence empowered by the Spirit, with that ultimate destiny to be conformed to the image of His Son. But then you have Romans 12 through 15. Be transformed. What does it look like? Well, you can't do it by yourself. You live in a body, Romans 12, 3 through 8. You learn how to love, Romans 12, 9 to 13, 8. Love. That's the transformed existence. And what Paul prays for at the end of Philippians chapter 3 is a community totally sanctified, and he wants to see them through. Well, beginnings are always exciting. But as I think of Paul's theology of transformation, think of your own church, think of your mission efforts, the excitement of starting. Less excitement after the new has worn off. What do we do as we try to shape and form people? The beginning is just the beginning. And God calls us to be agents of the transformation that we're talking about. I think I will stop on that. And looking at the transformation. And I hope these passages speak to us and to our congregations.